Coronation Street went out for the first time on the 9th of December, 1960, live, in black and white, and the newspapers gave it 3 weeks. One young man who walked onto that set as a 28-year-old is still in the cast this week, at 94, 66 years, and he has never left. Of the 9 faces in this video, 2 are still working on that street and 7 are gone, and one of those 6 died 8 days after getting married in a hospital ward. This is what happened to the people who built the longest-running drama on Earth. William Roache has to come first, and not only because he is the reason for that record. He plays Ken Barlow, and Ken Barlow was, on that first night, the most quietly radical thing in the programme. A working-class boy from a terraced house who has been to university and come home to find he no longer quite fits. Britain in 1960 was full of those young men, and television had never once shown them one. Roache was born in Basford, Nottingham, in April 1932, the son and grandson of doctors, and he did not begin anywhere near a stage. He was commissioned into the Royal Welsh Fusiliers in 1953, made lieutenant the following year, and left as a captain in 1956, having served in the Middle East and the Caribbean. A mortar explosion during that service left him with tinnitus he has carried for 70 years. The man who has spent his life in a fictional Salford backstreet was a real army officer first. It is worth knowing how close the whole thing came to never happening. Tony Warren was 23 years old and working at Granada television when he wrote it, and he had to fight to get it made at all. He wanted to call it Florizel Street. It was a tea lady at the studio, a woman called Agnes, who pointed out that Florizel sounded like a brand of disinfectant, and so the name was changed to Coronation Street. That is how the longest-running drama on Earth got its title. From a woman with a trolley who thought it sounded like something you scrub a floor with. The critics were no kinder. The television reviewer of the Daily Mirror watched the first episode and wrote it off completely, declaring the whole thing doomed and predicting it would not survive 3 weeks, because nothing happened in it except ordinary people in ordinary kitchens. He was right about the ordinary people. He was wrong about everything else. And he's been wrong for 66 years, which is a long time to be wrong in a national newspaper. Tony Warren saw Roache in a Granada play and decided he was Ken. Roache signed for 3 months. It is now 4,935 episodes and counting, and the Guinness Records people list him as the longest-serving television actor in a continuous role anywhere in the world. Nobody is going to beat that. It is not really possible to beat that. Think about what that has actually meant. Ken Barlow has been married 3 times on screen, buried 2 of those wives, watched his own children grow middle-aged, and had his heart broken on national television more often than any character in British history. Roache has played the same man through decimal currency, 3 recessions, colour television, the arrival of the internet, and 14 prime ministers. There are grandmothers watching this programme now whose own grandmothers watched him as a young man in a jumper arguing with his father about class. The life behind it has been much harder than the CV suggests, and he has never dressed it up. In November 1984, his daughter Edwina died at 18 months old. In 2009, his second wife Sarah died suddenly at 58. In 2018, he lost his elder daughter Vanya too. He buried a child, a wife, and then a second child, and kept turning up to work on a set where he had to be cheerful in a corner shop. There was money trouble as well. In 1991, he sued a newspaper for libel and won £50,000, and was then landed with £120,000 of legal costs, which took him into bankruptcy in 1999. And in 2013, at 81, he was arrested over historical allegations dating back to the 1960s. He stood trial. On the 6th of February 2014, the jury found him not guilty on every single count, and he was back filming by June. There is one more thing about him that says more than any of the records. When the programme built a new set and the old cobbles came up, and when cast members he had worked with for decades died one after another, he kept doing the job the same way. Word perfect, on time, no fuss. Actors half his age describe him as the calmest person on the lot. He has outlasted every producer, every writing team, and every fashion in British television, and he did it by being reliable rather than remarkable, which is exactly what the part required. He was made an MBE in 2001 and an OBE in 2022, and he is on the cobbles as you watch this. At 94 years old, the last man standing from the 9th of December, 1960. William Roache has spent 66 years playing an ordinary man, and there has been nothing ordinary about what he has had to carry home. The woman who lived across the road from him was called the sexiest thing on British television by a serving Prime Minister, and the story of her last week is the saddest in this video. Second is Pat Phoenix, who played Elsie Tanner, and if you have never watched an episode of this programme in your life, you should still know what she did. In 1960, British television did not have women like Elsie. She was a divorcee at number 11 with grown children, a job in a factory, a temper, a series of unsuitable men, and absolutely no intention of apologising to anybody for any of it. She was written as the street scandal, and the audience adored her instead, which tells you rather a lot about what the country actually wanted. She was born Patricia Frederica Manfield in Fallowfield in Manchester in November 1923, and she had been performing since she was 11 when she turned up on BBC Radio's Children's Hour. She spent her 20s as a filing clerk doing amateur dramatics in the evenings in Northern Repertory. She invented the surname Phoenix herself, after the bird that comes back out of the ashes, which is either the best or the most on-the-nose stage name in British television history. Laurence Olivier said she was the best actress in the country. The Prime Minister, James Callaghan, called her the sexiest thing on television, and he said it out loud in public as Prime Minister. She played Elsie in 1,583 episodes across 24 years, leaving in 1973, coming back in 1976, and going for good in January 1984. Her private life ran hot. She married her Coronation Street co-star Alan Browning in December 1972, and he died of liver failure in 1979. She smoked 60 cigarettes a day for most of her adult life, and in March 1986, after collapsing at home, she was told she had lung cancer. Now the part that stops people. Her partner of many years was the actor Tony Booth, and on the 9th of September 1986, they were married at her hospital bedside in Cheadle. She was too ill to leave it. 8 days later, on the 17th of September, she died in her sleep, aged 62. Tony Booth's daughter Cherie was at the funeral. And 11 years after that, Cherie Booth's husband walked into Downing Street as Prime Minister. Elsie Tanner was Tony Blair's stepmother-in-law for 8 days. Thousands of people lined the route of her funeral in Manchester. Not fans queuing for a spectacle. Neighbours mostly standing outside their own houses because for 24 years she had been the woman across the road. Very few actors in this country have ever been mourned like that, and almost none of them for playing a factory worker. Pat Phoenix showed a rather buttoned-up country a woman who refused to be sorry, and the country loved her for 62 years. The next one gave British television its single most famous moment of grief, and she did it with a pair of spectacles. Third is Jan Alexander, and this is the section I have been looking forward to writing. She played Hilda Ogden. The curlers, the pinny, the 3 flying ducks on the living room wall, the endlessly hopeful woman married to the least ambitious man in England. Hilda is the reason people who have never seen this programme can still describe it. In 2005, a national poll voted Jean Alexander the greatest soap opera performer of all time, and it was not close. She was born Jan Margaret Hodgkinson in Toxteth in Liverpool in October 1926, and her route in was long and unglamorous. She spent 5 years working as a library assistant, then 12 years in repertory theatre in Oldham, Stockport and York, doing small parts and doubling as wardrobe mistress and stage manager, which is the actual job most actors of her generation had. She first appeared on Coronation Street in 1962 in a small role and came back as Hilda on the 8th of July 1964. Then, in 1984, came The Scene. Her screen husband Stan Ogden died because the actor playing him, Bernard Ewens, was seriously ill. Hilda comes home from the hospital. The neighbours are being kind. She is holding it together briskly the way that generation did. And then she is handed a paper bag containing his belongings, and she takes out his spectacles. And she stops. That is it. That is the whole scene. It is regularly named the finest single moment in the history of British television drama, and hundreds of viewers sent Jan Alexander condolence cards as though the man had actually been her husband. The partnership behind that scene deserves its own mention. Bernard Ewens played Stan Ogden opposite her for 20 years, and towards the end he was so unwell that his scenes had to be written around what he could physically manage. Alexander protected him on set, constantly and without discussing it, and when he died in 1984, the programme had to decide what to do with Hilda. What it did was give her the paper bag. Everything about Hilda was in the detail, and Jan Alexander invented most of it herself. The curlers that never came out, the headscarf, the pinny, the mural on the living room wall with the 3 flying ducks over it, which Hilda called her Muriel, and which is now the single most recognisable piece of set decoration in British television. It is in a museum. She left on Christmas Day, 1987, and nearly 27 million people watched her go. Still the largest audience the programme has ever had. What she did after leaving is almost as remarkable as what she did before it. Most actors who walk away from a part that big spend the rest of their lives being asked about it and never find another one. Alexander went straight into a second character that a completely different generation now quotes back at her, and she kept it going for 22 years, well past her 80th birthday. She spent those years playing Auntie Wainwright in Last of the Summer Wine, the terrifying junk shop owner who never let a customer leave without buying something they did not want. She never married. She said she had put the work first and did not regret it. She celebrated her 90th birthday on the 11th of October 2016 and died 3 days later in Southport Hospital. Jan Alexander was handed a pair of spectacles in a paper bag and gave a nation its definition of grief. The woman who ran that street before either of them arrived had spent 25 years as a professional pianist on the radio. Fourth is Violet Carson, who played Ina Sharples, the caretaker of the Mission Hall, the woman in the hairnet on the corner seat in the snug of the Rover's Return, judging the entire street over a bottle of milk stout. Ina was in the very first scene of the very first episode. If Elsie Tanner was what the street wanted to be, Ina was what the street was afraid of, and here is what nobody watching in 1960 would have guessed. Violet Carson was, by profession, a musician. She was born in Ancoats in Manchester in September 1898, and she came to acting extremely late. From 1935, she was on BBC Radio in Manchester playing the piano, and for 6 years she was the pianist on Wilfred Pickle's Have a Go, which in the 1940s was the most popular programme on British radio, pulling audiences of 20 million. She was a regular on Children's Hour. She spent 5 years presenting Woman's Hour. She was already, in her own right, one of the most familiar voices in the country before a single cobblestone was laid, and she brought all of it with her. Ina Sharples talks like a woman who has been talking to an audience for 25 years, because she had. The timing is a musician's timing. Watch her sit in the snug of the Rover's Return with a bottle of milk stout and take 90 seconds to demolish somebody's character, and you are watching a professional broadcaster who understood exactly how long a British audience will wait for a punchline. She was also, and this matters, 62 years old when the programme started. A woman past 60 was handed one of the 3 leading parts in a new drama in 1960 and kept it for 20 years. That would be a talking point today. Her private life had one great sadness in it, and she carried it quietly for 54 years. She married a road contractor called George Peploe on her 28th birthday in September 1926. He died 3 years later, aged 31. They had no children, and she never married again. There is one more thing about Ina worth saying to anybody watching this outside Britain, because it is easy to miss. She is not a comic old woman. She is the street's memory. She knows who everybody's mother was, which houses were bombed in the war, who owes what to whom, and who has been pretending. In a country that had just spent 15 years pulling itself back together, that character was doing a job, and Carson played her without a single ounce of sentimentality. She was awarded the OBE in 1965. She played Ina for 20 years and made her final appearance in April 1980 after developing pernicious anemia, and she died of heart failure in Blackpool on Boxing Day, the 26th of December 1983 at 85. It is worth stopping for a moment on what those 3 women meant together, because it was not an accident. Tony Warren built his street around Ina, Elsie and Annie Walker, the moral judge, the rebel and the snob, and gave the 3 biggest parts in a brand new drama to 3 women aged between 37 and 62 in 1960, when the rest of British television was almost entirely men in offices. That single decision is the reason the programme survived. It had somewhere to go that nothing else on air was going. Let me ask you something here, and I would genuinely like the answer in the comments. Which of these women ran your household's living room? Was your mother an Ina, an Elsie or a Hilda? Because in my experience, every family had a favourite and it was never negotiable. Violet Carson spent 25 years as the most reassuring voice on British radio and then became its most frightening woman on television. The one who comes next was in prison in 1998, and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom publicly demanded her release. Fifth is Anne Kirkbride, and hers is the story I find hardest to tell because she was only 60. She played Deirdre, the enormous spectacles, the smoker's voice, the perm, for 42 years, and she was the emotional centre of the programme for most of them. She was born in Oldham in June 1954. Her father Jack was a cartoonist on the Oldham Evening Chronicle, which is a lovely detail. The daughter of a man who drew the North for a local paper spent her life acting it out for the whole country. She was spotted in a Jack Rosenthal production and arrived on the street in November 1972 as a small part, and by 1974 she had a full contract. What happened next is the closest British television has ever come to genuine national hysteria. Twice. In February 1983, Deirdre had an affair with the factory owner Mike Baldwin and then chose to stay with Ken. Over 18 million people watched the episode. And during a Manchester United match at Old Trafford that week, the scoreboard interrupted the football to inform 60,000 people that Ken and Deirdre were reunited. Ken won, Mike 0. That is a fictional marriage being announced on a Premier League scoreboard. Then, in 1998, Deirdre was sent to prison for a fraud she had not committed. The tabloids printed stickers. People wore Free the Weatherfield One t-shirts in the street. And the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, publicly said that it was clear to anyone with eyes in their head that she was innocent and she should be freed, and asked his Home Secretary to look into it. A real Home Secretary. About a woman who didn't exist. Those spectacles, by the way, were not a costume decision. Kirkbride wore enormous glasses because she was short-sighted, and the wardrobe department simply kept making them bigger until they became the character. Half of what people remember about Deirdre Barlow started as an actress's own eyesight. Behind all of that, she was quietly having a much harder time. In 1993, she was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and she spoke openly afterwards about the depression that followed at a time when almost nobody in British public life did. She was clear of it within a year. She married a former actor, David Beckett, whom she had met on the set, in June 1992. She had one more quiet distinction as well. For 42 years, she played a woman who was allowed to be plain, badly dressed, frequently miserable, and constantly wrong about men. And the country loved her without reservation for all of it. There is no equivalent in American television of what Deirdre Barlow was permitted to be, and Kirkbride never once asked for the character to be softened or smartened up. Anne Kirkbride died at a Manchester hospital on the 19th of January 2015 of breast cancer that had spread to her brain. She was 60 years old. William Roache had played her husband for 42 years and described losing her as losing family, which by then it more or less was. Anne Kirkbride made the whole country care so much about a woman who never existed that the Prime Minister had to comment on her prison sentence. And the man she had that affair with, who spent 30 years being the one person Ken Barlow could not forgive, died in the most fitting way any soap character ever has. Sixth is Johnny Briggs, who played Mike Baldwin. If Ken Barlow was the street's conscience, Mike was its appetite. A Cockney factory owner who arrived in Weatherfield in 1976, bought a clothing works, employed half the women in the programme, and spent the next 3 decades taking whatever he wanted, including, for a while, Ken Barlow's wife. Every long-running drama needs somebody the audience enjoys disliking. Very few of them get one this good. He was born John Ernest Briggs in Battersea in southwest London in September 1935, the son of a master carpenter, and he was evacuated out of the city as a small boy during the Blitz. At 12, he won a scholarship to the Italia Conti Stage School, where the children in his classes included Anthony Newley and Nanette Newman, and he had his first film part at 13. He then worked as a stagehand at the Windmill Theatre, did 2 years of national service with the Royal Tank Regiment in Germany, and came back to the business in 1955. So by the time he walked into the Rover's Return, he had already been a working actor for a quarter of a century. That is why Mike Baldwin never once felt like a soap villain. The man playing him had done everything, and he underplayed the whole thing. He never shouted when a look would do it. He stayed for 30 years and 2,348 episodes, which is a longer run than most actors get in an entire career. And then the programme gave him one of the finest exits in its history. Mike developed Alzheimer's disease. The scripts followed it honestly. The confusion, the reversion to a past that had gone, the dignity going piece by piece. And in his final scene, on the 7th of April 2006, Mike collapsed with a heart attack on the cobbles and died in the arms of Ken Barlow. 30 years of loathing, 2 old men on the ground in the dark, and one of them holding the other. He was given a Lifetime Achievement Award that year and an MBE in the 2007 New Year Honours. He was married twice and there were 6 children. Johnny Briggs died peacefully in his sleep on the 28th of February 2021 at the age of 85. Johnny Briggs spent 30 years being the man everybody loved to hate, and he made sure the hating was always affectionate. The man who comes after him was laying hot asphalt on the roads of Manchester at 30 and had a heart attack at 35. 7th is Bill Tarmey, and if you want to understand why this programme has lasted, look at how he got there. He was born William Piddington in Ardwick, Manchester in April 1941, and he left school and went into the building trade as an asphalt spreader, following his stepfather. That is the job. Hot tar, roads, all weathers. He did it for years. He had a voice, though, and in 1968 he started singing in the northern clubs at night and picking up extra work on television in the day. He was a genuine club singer, not an actor doing an impression of one. And in November 1979 he turned up on Coronation Street as a man called Jack Duckworth, and from 1981 he was in it permanently for 29 years. There is a detail about how he got the part that tells you everything about how this programme worked. He was not a leading actor being brought in to shake things up. He was a man doing extra work and the occasional line who kept turning up, and somebody in casting noticed that he was completely and effortlessly believable as a Manchester man in his late 30s, because that is exactly what he was. Jack and Vera Duckworth became the most convincing bad marriage in British television. 2 people who bickered constantly for 3 decades and would each have been completely lost without the other. Nobody wrote them as heroes. They were a window cleaner and a factory worker with a stone-clad terraced house and no money, and the audience loved them more than any of the glamorous ones. His health was frightening from a young age. He had a serious heart attack at 35 and a stroke at 36. In January 1987, he underwent a quintuple bypass. In 2002, he was fitted with a pacemaker. He kept working through all of it, and he kept singing. 4 of his albums charted, and a version of One Voice recorded with a school choir reached number 16. What made the Duckworths work, and what nobody has quite managed to copy since, is that the programme never once invited you to laugh down at them. The stone cladding on the front of number 9 is a joke, and it is also exactly what a couple like that would have saved up for and been proud of. Jack's pigeons are a joke, and they are also the only thing in his life that is entirely his. Tarmey played him as a man with very little who had decided on the whole to be cheerful about it, and that is a much harder performance than it looks. He married Ali Cleworth in 1962 when he was 21, and they had 2 children and stayed together for 50 years. He left the programme on the 8th of November 2010 because his health had finally made it impossible. He died of a heart attack in Tenerife on the 9th of November 2012 at 71, almost exactly 2 years to the day after his last scene. Bill Tarmey laid roads for a living and ended up as the most beloved husband on British television. And the woman who spent 34 years shouting at him across that living room was, off camera, his closest friend in the world. 8th is Liz Dawn, Vera Duckworth, and the friendship is the point. She was born Sylvia Ann Butterfield in Leeds in November 1939, and like Tarmey, she came up through the northern clubs as a singer before anybody put her on television. She first appeared on the street in 1974 as a factory worker with a handful of lines, and when Jack Duckworth arrived in 1979, the 2 of them were put together and something clicked that no writer could have planned. For 34 years, Vera nagged, shrieked, schemed and defended her husband against the entire world. Off-screen, Dawn always said the hardest thing about leaving was saying goodbye to Bill Tarmey, who was her best friend. 2 club singers from the north of England who ended up as the most famous married couple in the country and were not married at all. In March 2004, she was diagnosed with emphysema. She kept going for another 4 years, and in July 2007, Granada announced that at her own request, Vera would be written out because the condition had worsened. Her last appearance was on the 18th of January 2008, and the way they wrote it out was to have Vera die peacefully in a chair with Jack finding her. a scene the country still talks about and one that Tarmey had to play about his best friend. There is something worth saying about both of them together. Jack and Vera were on screen for the whole of the 1980s and 1990s, the years when a great many British families were having a hard time. And the programme kept two working-class people at its centre who were never rescued by a windfall, never given a glamorous makeover, and never allowed to become tragic either. They just kept going, badly, cheerfully, together. That is a political statement disguised as a double act, and it ran for 30 years. She was appointed MBE in 2000 for her charity work, and in 2008 she was given the British Soap Award for Outstanding Achievement. She spent a great deal of her later life raising money for lung charities, which was not a public relations exercise. She knew exactly what the disease she had was going to do to her, and she talked about it plainly so that other people would stop smoking. A fair number of them wrote to say that they had. She married Don Ibbotson in 1965 and had 4 children. Liz Dawn died at her home in Whitefield, Greater Manchester on the 25th of September 2017 from complications of her lung condition. She was 77 and Bill Tarmey had gone 5 years before her. If these stories are worth half an hour of your evening, the subscribe button costs nothing and it genuinely helps. And stay with me because the last person on this list is still on that street and she is 92. Liz Dawn played the loudest woman in Weatherfield and spent 34 years quietly looking after the man she was shouting at. The one still standing beside William Roache first appeared on that cobbled street in 1964 and was sent away again after a single episode. The 9th and last is Barbara Knox, and I love how nearly this did not happen. She was born Barbara Brothwood in Oldham in September 1933, the daughter of a mill worker and a foundry moulder who later became a fireman. She left school at 15 and went to work as a telegraphist for the post office, tapping out other people's messages, and did amateur theatre in the evenings until she got her professional stage debut at the Oldham Coliseum in 1962. On the 2nd of December 1964, she appeared on Coronation Street as a woman called Rita Littlewood for exactly 1 episode, and that was that. Nothing came of it. It took another 7 years and 2 months before somebody at Granada remembered her and brought her back, in January 1972 as a permanent character. She has been there ever since. 54 years. Rita has been a nightclub singer, a newsagent, a foster mother and a widow several times over. But the storyline everybody remembers is Alan Bradley. In the late 1980s, Rita was living with a man who was systematically stealing from her, and when she finally escaped him, he tracked her to Blackpool and chased her through the streets. And he was hit and killed by a tram in front of her. More than 27 million people watched it. Knox won the TV Times Best Actress Award for that year, and the tram itself has since been preserved by a museum, which may be the most British sentence in this entire video. What is remarkable about Rita is that the character was allowed to grow old on screen without being sidelined into a joke. She kept the newsagent's shop. She kept singing. She fostered children in her 60s and 70s. British television has a very poor record with women over 60, and this programme has quietly employed 2 of them in leading roles for longer than most of its viewers have been alive. She married Dennis Mullaney in 1956, and they had 3 children before divorcing in 1977. A second marriage ended in 1994. She was given a Lifetime Achievement Award in 2004 and made an MBE in 2010. There is a lovely symmetry in the 2 of them being what is left. Roache came in on the first night in 1960 and stayed. Knox came in for 1 episode in 1964, was sent away, and came back 7 years later and stayed. Between them, they have given something close to 120 years of service to one programme, and neither of them has ever made a fuss about it, or written a bitter memoir about it, or gone off to Hollywood to see whether the grass was greener. She is 92 years old, she turns 93 next month, and she is the 2nd longest serving member of the cast, behind only the man we started with. 2 people, both in their 90s, walking onto the same set they first walked onto when Harold Macmillan was Prime Minister. Barbara Knox was let go after 1 episode in 1964 and has now been on that street for over half a century, so that is where they all are. William Roache and Barbara Knox are still working, Pat Phoenix, Violet Carson, Jean Alexander, Anne Kirkbride, Johnny Briggs, Bill Tarmey and Liz Dawn are gone. And here is the answer to the question underneath all of it. How does a programme about a back street in Salford, written by a 23-year-old in 1960 and given 3 weeks by the critics, still exist in 2026? It is not the storylines, it is that it was built out of people like these: an army captain, a filing clerk, a library assistant, a radio pianist, a cartoonist's daughter, an evacuee from the Blitz, an asphalt spreader, a club singer, and a post office telegraphist. None of them were stars when they arrived. All of them had done something else first, and all of them brought it with them. And it is why nothing that has tried to copy it has ever quite worked. You cannot cast this. You can only find it, and Granada found it in Manchester in 1960. Because it looked in the clubs and the repertory theatres and the radio studios of the North instead of in London. That is why the street felt real, because the people standing in it had lived on one. Which of them do you miss the most? Tell me in the comments. I read them all.